Okay, so welcome everyone. Today is March 19th, 2026, and we are here on the COVES Community of Practice webinar to discuss data collection targets and sampling statistics. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So if you attended December's Community of Practice webinar, you'll remember that when I talk about statistics, I tend to get a little bit excited. That either means I have a lot of things to share or I talk a lot, but hopefully it's all good. As I mentioned before we started the recording, please do use the chat for questions. Um, and I want to acknowledge a few things about COVES and myself in particular that we have put a lot of thought into these topics in particular and the way we support you in thinking about sampling and setting targets. So we're good, but we're never perfect. There's always room for improvement. So as you have questions or as you have concerns, please do bring them back to the COVES team, whether it's on this webinar or through our email. We'll take everything in good faith, but I want you to consider this information critically in case there are things that we need to put more thought into. We want to make sure we're doing the right thing. All right, here we go. So, too long didn't read. I had this slide at the very end, and then I realized that's counterintuitive for the whole TLDR aspect. But if you have to hop off this call earlier, if you only take a few things away, here's my basic recommendations. Do your best to hit your survey targets. Trust the process. We put a lot of thought into this. If you are unable to, or you're looking at a subset of data for any reason that has a small sample size, proceed with caution. Small sample sizes have more error baked into them, no matter how good you are at random sampling, how much you follow the standardized data collection methodology, and any of those pieces. If and when you have questions, when you're reporting your data or considering your sample, consult us. Again, we have some expertise. We're happy to share it. We're happy to talk through your reporting concerns or any questions you've gotten from other members of your team. And lastly, stick to the standardized data collection method, as I will reference at least once in this slideshow. Quality over quantity, even though I'm going to be focused on hitting the correct sample sizes, the quality of your data matters much more than the quantity because it is very easy to collect a lot of bad data and draw a lot of bad inferences. So here is one of the reasons why we suggested this topic for a community of practice call. We hear some of these questions very often. Can't we collect fewer surveys? It's a lot of data. It's a lot of data collection. Conversely, why don't we collect more surveys? And baked into that is specific questions from members of your organizations that might sound something similar to, my leadership team is worried that our sample size isn't exponentially more. And I see some nods in agreement. What is the response to that? How do I defend this process and the amount of data we collect? So the good news is I've got answers for all of those. Hopefully they're good answers, but I will do my best to give you the information you need to address any of these questions. And here's the way I'm going to do it. We're going to talk through annual target setting, so the why, proportional sampling, the how, sampling statistics and confidence intervals and margins of error in particular. So this is the nerdy part where I will get really excited and use some big words and hopefully not lose too many people. And then we're going to return all the way back to some of the trainings that you've already had around data collection methodology, and I'll end with caveats in data use, right? And then we'll go to Q&A. So this is the why of target setting. Why sample size targets in general? And please also excuse the formatting for this community of practice call. This is the first time I've actually presented on this, which is surprising to me, but that means I have more words than pictures, so it might involve a little bit of reading. I'll do my best not to just read everything that I've written down. What we do in the process of setting sample size targets is to give you confidence in the adequacy of your data. Now, as you might remember if you attended December's webinar, sampling involves taking a small piece of something that's much bigger, in this case, your annual visiting population, right? So we're taking some of the visitors and asking them to give us information, which we then try to generalize about all visitors. If we didn't give sample size targets about how to do this in a vacuum or with no guidance, my hunch and through our experience is that everyone would kind of do things differently. And in our efforts to make COVES a standardized system that you can trust and rely on, we want to make sure you have goalposts for success. And again, if we didn't have these targets, aggregation and benchmarking would be compromised for us because everyone would be doing something different. We wouldn't have reliable samples from everybody, and there wouldn't be real concrete ideas of what counts for good or bad data collection. Not to say anyone's bad, but there are things that are gooder in these cases when it comes to the statistics behind your samples. And if you've been doing this long enough, you'll either understand the different sample size targets from month to month or weekday to weekend, or maybe just museum to museum. So why different sample size targets? Well, I always go back to this quote that equal is not fair and fair is not equal. We are all abundantly aware of that when it comes to our museum capacities, whether that's about our finances or our staff sizes, anything like that. And so what we want to do based on the differences between organizations is give you something that is feasible. And I'm going to come back to this element of feasibility over time throughout this presentation because it's really important for how we consider sampling and target setting. Now, throughout all of this, if I do anything else, please remember that we want to be true to our data. This is not kind to our board members. This is not nice to our staff members. This is not polite to our visitors. Although all those things are very important, when I take a step back and think about what COVES is, it is giving you data and being truthful to the data. And there is this saying from Ronald Coase, who was a economist originally, I believe, with the London School of Economics and then with the University of Chicago, who said if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And if you've been doing COVES long enough, you probably know that's true. You can take your COVES data and whittle it down to a specific response or a subset of responses and get it to say almost anything you want to. But that doesn't make it truthful. So one of the things that we try to do in this goal setting process of giving you sampling targets is to make sure, again, that you have data that are truthful and you can respond to it. As I mentioned 2 slides ago about the aspect of feasibility, there are 4 principles of evaluation theory that we always review in one or more of the COVES trainings, and those are utility, feasibility, propriety, and accuracy. Feasibility is the one that comes most into play when it comes to the sampling targets, because if we propose a system that is not possible for you to carry out, then the system falls apart immediately, right? Conversely, if we give you targets that are so small as to be laughable and your data are not trustworthy, the system falls apart equally. So you can imagine that if I said, good luck, your goal for the next year is to collect 10% of your visiting population through surveys, right? That might be 5,000, that might be 500,000, depending on the size of your organization. It might be much smaller than that, but the problem would be that it would be impossible based on given constraints. So the question is, we want truthfulness in our data, we want reliability and validity, but at what cost? So feasibility is our balancing act of setting targets that are adequate for the statistical properties we need in a survey, but also reasonable for you to collect. We use a bucketed target system. And in fact, this is the very first bucketing system we ever designed when COVES turned into a membership model. 3 tiers, small, medium, and large, 500, 800, and 1400 at the annual level. So we started with that, but as you can tell, our system was not designed to grow in the way that it has. And as you might guess from the way this table is set up, we particularly didn't think about growth in the smaller end of our museum or organizational structures. So we started to diversify our recommended sampling buckets to include more and more smaller organizations. And if this looks vaguely familiar, or you can start to identify yourself, you'll see here that post-pandemic, we've evolved into an 8-tier system based on some attendance ranges. And again, these are just, I wouldn't call them placeholders, but they're obviously very rough estimates based on organizational sizes. And I put that red arrow there to draw attention to the fact that you can now see 4 tiers of small and then 4 tiers of not small, right? Now, interestingly, you'll notice that the target for every single one of those small buckets is still the same. And that's really important. And I'm going to go over that too. But I want you to think about where your organization is, where your annual target is in relation to your attendance range. And for those of you who are quick at mental math, you'll notice that very few, if any of these, with the exception of the smallest organizations, approach even 1% of our visiting population through our survey targets. So that might be the criticism you hear from leadership or have gotten from other people. But again, there is a perfectly good explanation and a lot of statistical defenses behind it. The first of which is our multiplier effect. So keep in mind that when COVES surveys visiting groups, that survey represents multiple individuals. So looking at the sample size of surveys and your total attendance is not an apples to apples comparison. One is a group number, one is an individual number. So when I look at all of the COVES targets, I use a 2.5x multiplier. That's a conservative estimate of the average group size across organizations. You should look at your COVES data to get a better understanding of what your average group size is. And that way you can use a multiplier on your sample size as well to go through some of the calculations we're going to do. But again, keep in mind that surveys represent groups and attendance numbers represent individuals. And so those two things are immediately going to be in conflict a little bit. In determining these targets, if I were to go back a couple slides to that big table and show you the organizational sizes based on attendance ranges and the suggested targets that we set, I want you to keep in mind that we do prioritize the statistical rigor of our system to give you the confidence in using your data and in talking to your colleagues about what the data means. And I say this because there are two basic principles that I want you to hold on to. The first is that at the small end, you will lose a lot by collecting a little, meaning if you are on the smaller sample size, or if you're failing to hit your targets, smaller sample sizes can have disastrous effects on your interpretations, right? So collecting an adequate minimum is really, really important. If you are a larger organization, or if you're a smaller organization with a lot of capacity and you really want to stretch your goals, keep in mind that there is a very, very small return on increasing that sample size unless you were to triple it or exponentially increase your data collection. The statistical properties are not in favor of collecting 100 more than your 800 sample or something like that. But if your sample is suggested to be 500 and you only collect 400, that has a much different influence on your ability to interpret your data. So again, you lose a lot at the small end and you gain very little at the large end. So going back to that TLDR slide, try and hit your targets. Okay, that was all the why of the sampling. Now I'm going to walk you through very quickly the how. Hopefully this is very intuitive for all of you because in your trainings, we've requested from you your daily attendance numbers, and we've talked a little bit about how we use that to shape your survey targets. Here you can see an image depicting a population of a couple different colors. We can stratify that by color. You can see that there's more blue represented than black. Proportional sampling would take a larger amount of blue, then red, and similarly then black, where a disproportionate amount of sampling or an even or uniform amount of sampling would have the same from each group. Now, we don't have a good stratified understanding of our audience by race or ethnicity or visitation statistics. We sometimes have ticketing information based on members and non-members, but we can't visually identify members and non-members. But what we can, quote unquote, visually identify, in this case, I guess by a calendar, is visitation ebbs and flows, right? The visitation patterns throughout the year. So if more visitors are coming in the summer or during vacation months, you collect more data during those periods. That's a known quantity. We use historic records from your attendance to give you that confidence that when more people are in the building, you should collect more data. That way it becomes more representative rather than a uniform or disproportionate sampling approach. Don't pay attention to the numbers here, but this is literally how we do it. I copied and pasted from our attendance target setting spreadsheet. We take monthly targets, we sum them usually across the 3 most recent years of attendance data that we have available to us. We compute an average for those months across the years, and then we sum the averages and compute the proportion that falls under each month. So again, even if you're trying to read the numbers, you can see here that July and August, unsurprisingly, have the highest percentages on average over time. The goal of using the 3 most recent years of data is to normalize or minimize the ups and downs caused by temporary exhibitions, weird weather patterns, any kind of spikes in attendance that are not able to be predicted or unlikely to occur again in the future. We actually want to minimize those as much as possible. And we don't want to minimize the fact that July and August are larger in attendance than the rest of the months, but we want to make sure if you had a huge blockbuster exhibition in October, that we're not suggesting you collect 25% of your overall sample in a weird month when that's never going to happen again. If you are one of those sites that have been able to provide daily attendance to us, where we can break out weekdays and weekends, we take the same or a similar approach, I should say, comparing the weekend proportion of visitation within each month. So rather than looking at averages of the raw data across all of the months, we just look at the proportion within each month that come on the weekends, and we normalize that across 3 years of visitation data to give you the subsection of your monthly goal that should be collected on the weekends. You can see here in the same example, June, July, and August, as those align with the summer months when we tend to have more flexibility in visitation for our visitors. The weekend proportion is much lower because people can come during the weeks when kids are out of school or other things are going on. Whereas in the months of March, September, October, 50% of audiences in this institutional example are coming on the weekends. That is when people are in the building. That is an indicator of when data should be collected. So again, we use your historic attendance patterns to give you an idea of when people are in the building and when you should be collecting data. Here is that same visual broken out a little bit based on some of those examples we saw. July, August, school vacation months. I think the one we looked at, in fact, I know the one we looked at was the Museum of Sciences. In Massachusetts, school vacation is February and April. So you could see higher peaks there. Those are the blue months. May, September, and October, right before school gets out, right when school goes back. Those are the black months. We have the fewest people in the building. We collect the least amount of data. Everything else is a red month. Okay, so that's kind of the image broken out in the how we do it. But I want you to keep in mind that we use historic attendance to predict future attendance. It's a prediction. And so inherently, we're probably wrong. Hopefully, we're not really wrong, but these are our best guess as to what you can expect as far as visitation based on what we know from your attendance records. This is often what we do with data in general. Our best guess of what is going to happen is based on what has happened in the past. And because I already referenced March Madness on this call, if you look at my bracket, it's based on the number of upsets that happened last year. I tried to do something similar, and I'm still going to come in last place, no doubt. But I continue. Now let's get into sampling statistics. You all know that I'm a fan of trying to bring a little bit of humor to talking about something that many don't find to have a lot of humor. But in this case, you can see that the bars with the shortest error bars around them talking to the other bar with a big error bar around them saying we just can't trust you. And this is exactly what I want to talk about next, the amount of error that's baked into any one of our point estimates. So a lot of words on the screen. I'm not going to read them all. Populations and samples, we've already discussed a little bit on this call, and we discussed in more depth on the December Community of Practice call. But the confidence level, which is not the same thing as a confidence interval, the confidence level is the probability that your sample reflects the true population, whereas the margin of error is the uncertainty around that estimate. This is also often referred to as the random sampling error. Our goal in giving you monthly survey targets and weekend survey targets within those months is to give you an annual sample that delivers a 95% confidence interval, which in social sciences is the standard, at less than a 5% margin of error. Now, there's two things you should understand in those goals that COVES has. One, it's impossible to have 100% confidence in zero error. In order to do that, we need to ask every question of every person and have everybody fill out the survey completely. No skips, no blanks, no groups saying no, et cetera, et cetera. We're never going to have perfect information, so there will always be error in these estimates. The best bad example I can think of was No Child Left Behind in the early 2000s when the federal administration said, all schools will have performance records of this, but the tests that they used were norm referenced. And if you're familiar with norm referencing, it is a comparison to your peers. So someone's going to be at the bottom of the list. which meant that 35% in this case of the No Child Left Behind schools were going to fail no matter what. It was a bad system because it was predicated on 100% success. We're never going to have that. So all sampling efforts involve trade-offs. In this case, how much data to collect, when to collect it, what is my margin of error, and what is my confidence level. Now, there are some recommendations to go at a higher confidence level and have the margin of error be a trade-off, but I disagree with that, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit too. So terms and definitions continued. This is an example of what the confidence level in the margin of error mean in practice. If 40% of respondents indicate they have an excellent experience on our OER scale, that means that there's a 95% chance that between 35 and 45% of the population truly had an excellent experience, right? So the 5% margin of error is on both sides. 5% margin of error gives you a 10% window, which is pretty big if you think about what a point estimate is. So that is the biggest margin of error that we are comfortable with. Our goal is to make it less than that. 95% confidence, again, that's pretty good. You can see the footnote at the bottom here. Basically, that means if you were to do a random sample 100 times, 95 of those samples would get it right. All right, here are two calculators that we're going to use that you can use at home that I have used to kind of guide some of the thinking around this. Allison is going to drop them in the chat so you don't have to copy and paste them or anything like that. And we can share these after the call as well. These are from SurveyMonkey. Even though we don't use SurveyMonkey, I am very much appreciative that they offer these as a free resource online. This is a screenshot of what it looks like. You can see it's very simple. There's 3 inputs: your overall population size, the confidence level that we already talked about, we're going to use 95%, and then the sample size. Now, one of the calculators that we link to is the sample size estimator. So you can actually put in your confidence level and your desired margin of error to see what your sample size should be if you have other evaluation or research studies that you're planning. I'm going to show a couple tables here that emphasize this whole notion of 95% confidence level and our margin of error. This is every one of those institutional sizes that we showed before. The annual survey target in kind of the faint font on the left, 500, 500, 500, 500, 1,000, 12, or 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, based on the attendance ranges, and I did the low end and the high end of those ranges if they have one, and then the estimated margin of error from that calculator. Don't read too much, but notice that every one of the margins of error is below 5%. It's actually 3% or lower. If you hit your targets, your margin of error around anything on the COVES survey will be sufficiently narrow to give you the confidence that you need if you hit your targets. Here are some other examples of people who are not hitting their targets. This is totally made up. I just pulled some numbers out of thin air and I said, like, what would it look like if you had a target of 500, but you're only collecting 100 a year? You can see here that the margin of error goes up. Now, 6% isn't terrible, right? And keep in mind that the margin of error I'm using is based on that 2.5 person multiplier. It's not based on a sample size of 100. It's based on a sample size of 250 people. But the margin of error is still higher than we want to give you the comfort in reporting back to your board, to your colleagues, to anyone else who's looking at these data, right? A 6% margin of error on either side is a 12% range, and that's big. Now, importantly, as you go down the table, even though every single one of these examples, or most of the examples, are missing their targets, failing to hit their targets, you can see that the margin of error still gets smaller. This goes back to what I said earlier. You're more in danger of losing out on small sample sizes, that big opportunity if you've got a small sample size, and you almost never make it up by collecting more data at the high end. And I can double down on this too in a few slides. But before I give more examples of the margin of error, I want to talk a little bit about our data collection methodology. This is actually kind of a gruesome graphic. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, it says garbage in, data out. If you are a data person like me, or even if you've just been around long enough, you know that expression or the acronym GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you put something poor into a fancy statistical model, it doesn't matter what you get out because the information you had to begin with was poor. So these are a number of examples of ways you can abuse the COVE system to get more data, but you'll get less out of it. Sure, you could email people. You could ask every single person who walks in the building. You could throw that QR code up. You could Put an unstaffed iPad kiosk somewhere in the building so that people can do it like it's a digital comment card. But every one of these are going to lead to discrepancies and data integrity losses over time that's not going to compensate for a lower sample size. So, this is why standardized data collection is essential. Please, please, please do the standardized COVES data collection method. This is predicated on systematic random sampling, using a staff person at the exit of the museum to do an intercept protocol, and using the invisible line tactic or whatever you can to minimize any source of bias, right? And we can go over this not on today's call, but on a separate training, like we had that data collection workshop a couple weeks ago, where we can reiterate why all these things are important. But again, all of the information that I'm sharing around these confidence intervals, the sample size targets and the margins of error are predicated on our standardized data collection method. And the last thing I want to talk about with respect to methodology is that this is a marathon. We've talked about an annual sample size, right? We're looking at the big picture, the population of museum visitors that come in a given year. So don't think about it like it's a sprint, think about it like it's a marathon. And if you're a runner and you have a target goal in mind and you are off your target at mile, 6 out of 26, you think about how you're going to adjust your tactics in the second half or the second three-fourths of the race to make up for that. The same thing is true with data collection for COVES. If you fall behind one month, you get ahead the next month, right? We never assume that you're going to hit your target on the head every single month. You're 5 short one month, you're 5 ahead the next month, you hit the target the third month. It's an ebb and flow across the course of the year that by the end, you've collected sufficient data based on the sample targets that we give you that you've got confidence in the data. So don't think that you can collect 5 surveys one month, 5 surveys the next month, 5 surveys the next month, and then compensate by collecting 400 just to make up the difference. That is not feasible and not helpful because that will not lead to sustainability over time. No questions in the chat, Allison? Okay, great. I'm going to keep going. And I promise I'm almost done talking at you, and then hopefully we can talk together, talk with you. So a few caveats about all of this, and in fact, I've mentioned most of them already. One, all of the math, all of the examples that I'm showing you are going to break down if you don't at least approach your annual sample target. So, if you're falling dramatically short of the targets that we set, in particular, if your sample size is 350 or lower, no matter what your organizational size is, you should think about how you are going to present your data or interpret your data. And if you're collecting less than 100 surveys a year, your sample is essentially going to be statistically flawed. That is one of the reasons why we exclude organizations that collect fewer than 100 surveys a year in our aggregate reporting, because the data essentially can't be trusted at the level that we expect them to in our standardized protocol. So my recommendation, to the best of your ability, hit your targets. I'm going to show some slides next that don't make me happy, but I want to emphasize the importance of this. It is March. We've completed 8 months of the current fiscal year, starting July 1st. And after 8 months, only 16% of all COVES members this year are at or above their target, at or above their 8-month target. So that means, even though we have a bunch that are very close, and coming close to your targets is really good and will give you statistical confidence, there's a lot that are falling far shorter. In fact, almost half of all sites have collected fewer than 50% of their suggested target through the end of February. So this is a wake-up call, hopefully, that if you are not collecting at the level that we're recommending, there are going to be some complications in your interpretability and your ability to use the data effectively for the purposes that we suggest. So hopefully this is not shaming. I'm not identifying anybody by name, but I want to remind us all how important it is to collect sufficient data so that we can use it well. Caveat number 2, much of this suggested advice around margins of error and statistical confidence breakdown when you analyze the data on a non-annual interval. Now, that's easy to get around, but I'm going to show a few examples of how monthly reporting can destroy this, because you're essentially taking what is apparently a very large monthly sample or population size, but a very, very small monthly sample size. So you can see here some of the same bucketed targets, annual targets of 500 surveys, um, and the attendance if we'd used a uniform distribution, meaning dividing 50,000 museum visitors by 12 to get a monthly attendance or by 4 to get quarterly attendance. All of the margins of error listed in red reflect that increased uncertainty by doing more granular reporting than an annual reporting system. This is easily sidestepped by doing a rolling time frame to identify trends. What I mean by a rolling time frame is if you're very interested in February's data, instead of looking at February by itself, take November, December, January, and February. 4 months of rolling data that includes February and compare that to the 4 months prior, or multiple intervals of 4 months that overlap, so you can see how things are changing up and down over time, which will give you the statistical confidence you need in including February's data without isolating it entirely. And I know there's a lot of words and maybe a complicated thought, but if you have questions about that, let me know. And the third caveat that I'll introduce is probably the most important, which is small samples compromise your ability to disaggregate data by subgroups. This is one of the most important things that COVES can recommend to you, which is to analyze by subgroups, right? But particularly for subgroups that are very small proportions of our overall audience, the level of uncertainty around those smaller groups can lead to uncertainty or imprecision in our understanding of them. My recommendation to you is to own that uncertainty, to recognize that when we use the phrase underrepresented groups, I'm not trying to be tokenistic about specific people or specific audiences. I'm literally talking about the proportion that they represent within our data, and that's okay. Because assuming we're following the standardized data collection protocol and we're doing a random intercept model, there is reason enough to believe that those responses are valid and that we can analyze larger periods of time to, in theory, have a larger sample by which to investigate these groups. So this goes back to the idea of a marathon, not a sprint. We need more data, not less. We need more time, not less, to have sophisticated insights into groups that are really important to our understanding of audiences. Okay, I can tell I'm getting close to the end of my slides because my mouth is getting dry. I've been talking a lot. Here are some parting thoughts, and then I see that there are some chats coming through. I'm not sure if those are questions or just comments. I'll reiterate the same advice I gave at the very beginning of this slide deck. To the best of your ability, hit your sample targets. If you have specific reporting needs, consult with us so we can give you some advice on how best to share that information with others in your organization. And importantly, if you're regularly unable to hit your sampling targets, please interpret your data with caution because it is not as trustworthy as we would like it to be. That is why we have the sampling targets in place. When does this advice matter most? And I'm going to give you the opposite of when. When not. When does this advice not matter? It does not truly matter when you're doing important presentations. In fact, what we found is that if you talk about confidence intervals or margins of error, or you putting error bars on any of your graphs when reporting to important stakeholders, you're probably going to draw more attention to the fact that we're doing a sampling exercise, and there's going to be more questions about the statistical elements of this survey than you want. Now, again, they're all defensible, and I can give you a whole write-up on how you can respond to those questions, but I don't recommend that you use error bars in presentations to groups like your Board of Trustees. I also don't think it's necessary when reporting single-year point estimates. For example, your single-year Net Promoter Score or overall experience rating, or any of those things, they don't need margins of error around them. You just need to understand that whatever number you're reporting, there is a little uncertainty around. Now, if you're doing comparisons over time or between groups, this is when two numbers that look different, 71 and 73 as a Net Promoter Score, could be functionally the same because of the random error that's introduced through sampling. And this is when inferential tests will be a friend to you because they can explain if two numbers are statistically significantly different or just perceived to be different and not actually meaningfully different. And that is when I'd encourage you to go back to our December Community of Practice webinar or email the COVES team so we can guide you through how best to analyze those data. So coming full circle on the conversation now, can we collect fewer surveys? Well, you can, but I will not advise you to because your interpretations and inferences would fall through, right? It wouldn't do justice to the whole thing we've set out to do through COVES. Why don't you collect more surveys? You can, assuming you don't change the standardized methodology, you have the staffing or financial capability of doing so, and you still stick to the proportional sampling that we talked about at the very beginning, where you're collecting more data when more people are in the building and fewer data or fewer surveys when fewer people are in the building. And lastly, this question from leadership teams that you don't have a sample size of, pick a number. Two common refrains. One, you can quote back to them how we set your sample targets. Your annual sample size meets common statistical recommendations with a 95% confidence level and less than a 5% margin of error. And you can even go back and adjust that 5% to the 2 or 3% or whatever yours is. And you should also remind anybody who asks that your collected survey sample represents the multiplier based on the average group size in terms of individual visitors. That tends to answer a lot of questions for a lot of people. If you say my survey sample is 500, but that actually represents 1,250 people, that changes the game a lot for most folks. So all the way back to the beginning, hit your targets, trust the process, interpret small samples with caution, consult us, and stick to your data collection methods. And I'd like to open it up to questions and discussions. If you're watching this as a recording, I'm going to hit pause now, and you can catch up to the discussions by talking with us. I'm going to leave you with this quote that was also on December's call because it kind of flies in the face of what we're talking about. But while it's easy to lie with statistics, it's even easier to lie without them. So even if we're talking about the importance of collecting sufficient data, collecting the data at all is really important because without the data, you have nothing. Stopping sharing and stopping the recording if I know how to do that.